Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On a quiet block in Mesa, Arizona, a welfare check turned a suburban address into a crime scene. Friends hadn't heard from Travis Alexander for days. Missed messages stacked up. A work trip was coming and he hadn't packed or called in. Late that evening, several friends went to the house, found the master suite door locked, and forced entry. What they saw sent one of them to place a 911 call. Normal was over. From that point forward, this is one house, one timeline, one verdict. No spin, no fiction, just crime examined the way investigators work it. Patrol arrived and did what procedure demands. Freeze the scene, move the people out, and hand control to detectives. The search perimeter was defined by the footprint of the master area, hallway to master bath to shower, and not a step beyond without documentation. First responders note sights, sounds, and positions because that's what holds up later. No conclusions, just observations. A quiet room, controlled lighting, and a single self-contained scene inside a home that looked otherwise routine from the street. The victim was identified on site as Travis Alexander, male, early 30s, Mesa resident. No dramatics are needed here. He was found in the master bathroom, and the bathroom was treated as the core. The rest of the master area became a corridor to and from that core. Detectives did not chase theories. They clocked and preserved photographs, measurements, and a strict path of travel log. Every entry and exit got a time. Every person inside the tape had a role and a reason. From the start, the investigative goal was simple: establish time and access. The time question focused on when Travis was last confirmed alive earlier that week and when contact dropped off. The access question focused on who could be inside a locked master suite and who knew his schedule. Friends and roommates offered context. Recent calls unanswered, a church and work community expecting him, and the oddity of days of silence from someone not known to vanish. That information is not gossip. It is the difference between a missing person look and a homicide response. Scene control never works if you treat a house like a rumor mill. Technicians documented the master hallway surfaces, the bathroom threshold, and contact points you'd expect in a private space. They recorded footwear impressions if present, latent areas for processing, and any biological traces within the corridor. Items in plain view were photographed as found before any collection. If something could smear, it waited for a senior tech. If a surface held a potential touch, it got a shield and a label. This is how you keep a case from becoming a story with two versions. Inside the laundry area, a digital camera was located in the washer. No assumptions were stated on scene. It was logged, sealed, and scheduled for controlled recovery and imaging later. The point here is not to editorialize why a camera ends up there. The point is to bag it without altering its memory or its moisture. Scene discipline keeps later analysis honest. That's how you ensure the same house you walked into is the same house the jury hears about years later. As the night wore on, a timeline began to take shape. The victim was last reliably seen earlier in the week. Friends discovered him about 5 days later. In the middle of that span, his phone activity tapered off. You won't hear GPS app paths or live ping mapping in this chapter. The time period predates that kind of routine artifacting. Investigators would later pull call records and cell site usage the way it was done then. For now, the team held the scene and the clock. They had what mattered most on day one: a single, consistent locus of events and a clean chain of custody. Mesa isn't a cliché backdrop. It is a planned pocket city where cul-de-sacs and home offices sit beside busy arterial roads. When violence enters that map, it doesn't just end a life. It unsettles a neighborhood. People who share driveways and garbage pickup schedules suddenly talk about locks and guest lists. That community reality stays in the background of this report, but it explains urgency: a single home, a single bathroom, and a finite set of surfaces that will now carry the weight of a felony case. The first night closed with the basics completed: bodies and surfaces documented, immediate hazards cleared, evidence sealed, and the master area resecured for daylight processing. Supervisors reviewed the log to make sure every handoff was written and every bag had a matching line. Nothing tanks a case faster than sloppiness in the first 12 hours. Nothing keeps a case straighter than humility about what you don't know yet. Investigators left with two priorities for the next phase. First, a controlled forensic walkthrough to convert observations into testable findings, contact traces, patterns, and any latent impressions. Second, a tight access map. Who had the means to be alone with Travis in that master space, and who expected to see him the day he disappeared from his routine? And the camera would be imaged in a lab, not on a desk. The phone records would be subpoenaed, not guessed at, and the people closest to him would be asked for facts, not stories. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. That is a thought investigators hold when a scene appears straightforward. Clean doesn't mean simple, it means careful. The next chapter will move from this controlled discovery to what those electronics revealed about Travis's last verified hours inside his own home. No detours, no gossip, just what the memory card and the clock can actually prove. The hours after scene control are about two things: who could be inside and when that access made sense. With Travis Alexander confirmed deceased inside the master bathroom, detectives move from general observations to a structured access map. The idea is simple, and it is held across thousands of felony cases. The smaller the footprint, the tighter the pool. One house, one master suite, one corridor in and out. They started with routine. In the days before discovery, Travis was expected to answer calls, confirm work items, and keep social commitments. He didn't. The lapse wasn't just unusual, it was measurable. Colleagues and friends had time-stamped attempts to reach him, saved messages, and calendar notes that would later be compared against phone company records. Those artifacts tell a story that human memory can't. When outreach stopped landing, and when the silence became statistically abnormal for him, entry and control came next. The exterior showed no sign of forced entry, and the home's traffic patterns suggested someone familiar with the layout. Friends encountered a locked master door during the welfare check. That interior lock was breached to get to him. Locked interior doors in a domestic setting generally mean two things: privacy when alive, access control when someone doesn't answer. What it didn't show was a break-in from the outside. In cases like this, investigators don't fill gaps with theory. They log what the hardware says. The path of travel into the master area mattered because it limited how many people could have been alone with him in a private space. Roommates and close friends helped anchor the access map. They described who had keys, who knew alarm habits, if any, who came and went without formal invitation, and who was scheduled to see him that week. Their statements established a list of people with legitimate reasons to be in the house and a much shorter list with a plausible reason to be behind a closed master door. None of that is an accusation. It's triage. If you can account for presence and purpose, you move down the list. If you can't, you move up. Investigators also isolated timing from routine markers. In the days he went silent, there should have been calls returned, a bag packed, or a confirmation for upcoming plans. There weren't. Those non-events matter because they break pattern. When a reliable person stops doing routine tasks, you mark the last moment the routine looked normal. That last normal becomes a pivot point. All entry and exit, all contact, and all activity are measured against it. The evidence from Chapter 1, one contained scene, paired with a clear last normal date, would give the lab and the phone record something to hit against. Mesa is a place where planned streets and predictable schedules shape daily life. When violence lands in a home like this, it disrupts a network of people whose time was usually synced: rides, meetings, church plans, calls. That disruption gave investigators leverage. They could compare statements, "I expected to see him at X," with external records, call logs, calendar entries, message timestamps. The goal wasn't to catch anyone in a contradiction. It was to find the moment the timeline bent. Next, the team documented legitimate visitors during the critical window. Deliveries, neighbors, and casual drop-ins can widen a pool if you let them. Here, the pool stayed tight. The master suite is not a foyer. You don't put yourself in a private bathroom by accident. Analysts wrote the names of people with intimate access in one column and put every other contact, work acquaintances, distant friends, service providers, in another. Then they froze the list until the digital evidence could confirm or contradict it. A practical note on method. Nothing in Chapter 2 assumes what the memory card or phone records will say. That restraint is intentional. You don't backfill a scene with data you haven't imaged yet. You secure the scene, you fix the structure of access, and you let the labs catch up. When the results arrive, you don't debate them. You align them to the access map you built when you had nothing but locked doors, a hallway, and a man who hadn't answered in days. There is a human point worth stating plainly. Investigations like this are not about casting suspicion on everyone who cared about the victim. They are about respecting how private space works. A master suite is where people assume privacy. Whoever is in that space with you is either trusted or invited, or has crossed a line that turns private life into public crime. The case advances by proving which one. By the end of this phase, detectives had 3 deliverables ready for the labs and the subpoenas to meet in the middle: a last normal time window, an ordered list of persons with plausible access to the master area, and a record of planned commitments the victim failed to meet. Nothing speculative, nothing theatrical, just a framework strong enough to carry whatever the electronics and forensics would bring next. The handoff from patrol to lab is where speculation ends. The camera recovered from the washer was sealed on scene, transported, and processed under standard evidence control protocols. No one scrolled through images in a squad room. In a clean lab, a forensic examiner documented exterior condition, removed the storage media, and performed a write-blocked acquisition. Both a logical copy and a full bit-for-bit image were created, verified by hash values so that every subsequent step could be defended. What the team saw in the lab is exactly what the device held when it left the house in Mesa. This is how a homicide crime case avoids becoming a debate about who touched what. With a verified image in hand, examiners worked in 2 lanes at once. The first was the file system, cataloging what existed in standard directories and noting any gaps in numbering. Consumer cameras typically write to a DCIM structure and follow a predictable increment. The gaps matter. They tell you if images were deleted, renamed, or overwritten. The second lane was carving, scanning unallocated space for JPEG headers and footers to recover files that were no longer indexed. Carved files don't carry friendly file names, but they do carry EXIF fields when intact: camera date, time, sometimes model, sometimes even thumbnail variants that survive deletion because they live in more than one place on the card. The result of that 2-lane approach produced a coherent run of images from a single afternoon. They showed consensual private moments inside the home and, most important for timing, they progressed into a second set taken in the master bathroom, placing Travis Alexander alive there late in the day, within minutes of the fatal window established by other records. None of this required a flourish. It required a clock. The EXIF date-time original field is the default clock for most consumer cameras, and even though camera clocks can drift, a good lab doesn't accept them at face value. The team cross-checked those timestamps against independent anchors: phone company logs for incoming or missed calls, the times friends last successfully pinged him, and basic Arizona timekeeping. No daylight saving shift to skew conversions. The camera's clock landed where it needed to, late afternoon into early evening, and its minute-by-minute sequence fit the real world. An examiner then focused on sequence integrity. If images are numbered in order and the EXIF times increment in a reasonable cadence, you can test for anomalies by graphing intervals between frames. A spike may indicate a pause. A broken run may suggest deletion or a power cycle. Here, the flow of numbered images and the recovered files from unallocated space closed the gaps. The progression inside the bathroom wasn't a collage. It was a timeline: position, framing, and lighting moving in ways that align with a person alive, present, and then no longer available to the people who were calling him later that evening. The photos did not show violence. They did not need to. They showed presence when it mattered and proximity to the only scene in play: the master bath. Because Arizona does not observe daylight saving time, the team didn't have to recalculate a seasonal shift, but they did confirm the camera's clock wasn't set to another time zone by accident. There are simple ways to check this without guessing. Examiners compare the timestamp of one known photo, say a shot taken earlier that day, with a reference event, a documented call, a message send time, or another electronic artifact. A small drift is common with consumer devices. A large one would be a red flag. The drift here was negligible, measured in minutes, not hours. That's enough for court, because the question in a homicide timeline isn't whether a picture was taken at 5:28:12 p.m. or 5:31:47 p.m. The question is whether the victim was alive in that bathroom shortly before he could no longer be reached. The images answered that. Deleted content drew special attention. When file carving brought back additional images, analysts avoided the trap of turning recovery into narrative. A deleted file can be a duplicate, a misfire, or nothing more than a standard clearout. The correct question is whether the sequence of recovered and intact files still forms a coherent run that ties the victim to time and location inside the scene. It did. Folder numbering, image counters, and EXIF fields cooperated enough to lock the afternoon without overpromising precision. That restraint matters. When the evidence already aligns with physics and routine, embellishment only creates room for doubt. The bathroom environment itself provided passive verification. Fixtures, towels, and layout, visible in the images, matched what was documented during the Chapter 1 walkthrough. No conflict between what the lens saw and what the technicians measured. That matches more than comfort. It is validation that the photos came from this house, this room, and not from some other location introduced later. This is how a prosecutor avoids letting a defense suggest that imagery lacks provenance. The chain of custody started at the washer, continued through sealed transport, and lived inside hash-verified images that can be replicated by an independent expert. One point of caution stayed on the examiner's notepad. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. It is a reminder that even when artifacts sing in harmony, an investigator checks for mechanical reasons they might do so. Auto timeset features, bulk edits, or a recopy that could spoof a sequence. None of those conditions presented here. The imaging workflow preserved metadata as found. The lab documented every tool version used to extract it. And when a second analyst reprocessed the card using a different suite, hash comparisons and field values matched. If you are going to put a photograph into a murder timeline, you do it with redundancy. Why this matters to the viewer is straightforward. The case turns on a single location and a narrow window. These photos aren't dramatic, they don't try to be. They place the victim alive inside the master bathroom late that day, narrowing the time between last confirmed life and discovery to a window small enough that other artifacts, phone company call records, cell site usage, travel data, can snap into place in the next phase. In towns like Mesa, where routine is the rule, digital evidence like this doesn't just tell you what happened. It tells you when you've reached the point where human memory can't carry the case anymore. There is a human dimension worth acknowledging without drifting into sentiment. Images like these were never meant for court. They were personal. In a real investigation, you treat them with the same restraint you expect from a jury. Their purpose here is not to scandalize. Their purpose is to answer the narrowest possible question. Was Travis alive in that bathroom shortly before he disappeared from his own routine? The objective answer is yes. And once that answer is secure, the investigation moves on. Photographs lock the room and the hour. Phones and road miles trace the corridor in between. Investigators subpoenaed carrier call detail records for the days bracketing the afternoon established in Chapter 3. In 2008, you don't expect app-based GPS history. You work with call and text logs, voicemail activity, and cell site usage. The goal is to see when a device talks to the network, when it goes quiet, and which towers it leans on when it comes back. The pattern around the critical window showed a familiar rule of homicide work. Communications that should have happened didn't. Communications that did happen happened at odd hours or from places consistent with extended travel. A gap in activity is not proof of anything on its own. People silence phones or lose signal. What matters is the sequence. Here, call records showed the victim's phone sliding into silence after the late-day images in the bathroom. On the other end of the line, calls that would normally get a quick response rolled to voicemail and stayed there. Messages piled up without callbacks. That's how investigators mark the change from unavailable to statistically out of pattern. They match those records against witness statements from friends and work contacts who expected to hear from him that evening and the next morning. Expectations and carrier logs pointed the same direction. At the same time, detectives moved on the road piece. Paperwork from a rental agency in Northern California showed a vehicle picked up shortly before the offense window and returned shortly after. A round trip logging significant mileage measured in the high thousands. Staff noted missing floor mats at return and described reddish stains that had already been addressed before police arrived. Those details are observations, not lab conclusions. The odometer, however, is a fact. In a case with one fixed scene, a long out-of-state loop matters because it can carry a person to and from that scene between timestamps without relying on any single witness to carry the story. Cell site records from a relevant number, calls, attempts, voicemail checks reflected movement across regions consistent with that road loop, a long south and eastbound leg, then a north and westbound return. Cell sites do not put a device on a specific street. They show coverage footprints that change across counties and states. The pattern here was unremarkable for a multi-state drive and notable only because of when the quiet periods began and when intermittent activity resumed. Silence during the narrowest part of the timeline, brief recontacts later, then regular activity when the device settled again. As a lab examiner once put it, no pings is a kind of ping. It tells you when not to expect an alibi built on routine communication. Witness testimony anchored parts of the return route. In Utah, a business acquaintance who met the traveler the day after the offense window noted freshly darker hair and cuts on the hands. Those are observations, not verdicts, but they become useful when they track with phone activity that has reappeared on towers in that region. Investigators logged the encounter, took a statement, and moved on. You don't build a homicide case on hair dye and bandages. You build it on aligned artifacts that disagree with coincidence. The state also documented a gas can loan in Northern California shortly before the trip, multiple cans borrowed from a prior acquaintance. The later argument made by prosecution was straightforward. Extra range without stopping can erase retail footprints and reduce camera hits. It can also be perfectly innocent on a long drive. Labeling matters. In this report, it sits where it belongs, as inference offered by the state, tested later in court against all other facts. The phone records do not prove purpose. They prove the presence or absence of activity across time. The gas can testimony does not place anyone in a bathroom. It addresses travel behavior. Those lanes stay separate until a jury is asked to consider them together. With subpoenas still active, Mesa detectives interviewed people tied to the travel. The rental was documented, photographed at return, and preserved to the extent possible given the vehicle had already been cleaned. The agency's notes were kept in their original form without embellishment. Investigators avoided the mistake of turning clerk remarks into conclusions. They secured what could be secured and sought any third-party data, tolls, hotel receipts, or traffic cams that might corroborate movement. Where those records were sparse, the cell site map did what it usually does in a 2008-era case. It filled in the broad strokes, not exact coordinates, but credible corridors. At this stage, the name behind the out-of-state loop mattered because it intersected directly with the victim's life. The traveler was Jodi Arias, a former intimate partner of Travis Alexander. Her name had been present in interviews as part of the access map from Chapter 2. It now sat in the center of the travel and telephony pattern. To be clear, call logs and car contracts don't convict anyone of a violent crime on their own. They define opportunity and compress timelines. In a case with one fixed scene tied to a narrow afternoon window, they also reduce the space for alternative explanations. Investigators added one more piece of pre-offense context to the timeline because it touched a technical question in court. A .25 caliber handgun reported stolen in the weeks before the offense from a home connected to Arias's family in Northern California. That report did not prove chain of custody to the scene. It offered a fact the state would later juxtapose with a .25 casing recovered in the master suite. Correct handling in this chapter is cautious. Track the report by date, park it in the timeline, and wait for lab findings before it does anything more. When you lay the telephony, the rental miles, the witness observations, and the pre-offense gun report over the bathroom photo sequence, the picture is not abstract, it is a schedule. A person with prior access was in motion before, during, and after the only hours that matter. The device associated with that person went quiet when the victim's phone fell silent, then reappeared along a route consistent with the rental's odometer, then arrived at a meeting a day later with a changed appearance and minor hand injuries noted by a witness. Each point is ordinary by itself. Together, they remove room for improvisation. You can respect the humanity on both sides without editing out the facts. People take trips, people make mistakes. Relationships end badly. What decides a homicide is not our opinions about those truths. It's whether independent systems, cameras, phones, rental contracts, carrier switches, Mark the same hours and the same corridor for the same person at the same time. Here, they did. The next phase is where biology decides what presence meant. The master corridor yielded the most decisive trace, a latent palm impression within blood on the wall. It was photographed in place, swabbed, and logged with an uninterrupted chain of custody. STR testing reported a mixture. One contributor was Travis Alexander, the other included Jodi Arias. Because the print sits in blood, the contact is post-injury, not ordinary background transfer. Labs stated the stats and stopped short of storytelling. The finding is narrow and strong. The medical examiner's report was clinical and restrained. Multiple sharp force injuries, a deep incised neck wound, and a single .25 caliber gunshot. No graphic detail, just mechanism and lethality in a confined bathroom. Separately, text documented a .25 casing at scene. No firearm was recovered, so no direct toolmark link was possible, but the caliber sits alongside a pre-offense .25 theft report in the timeline, properly labeled as context, not proof. Bloodstain work stayed conservative, mapping directionality and confirming that the palm impression was embedded in blood, not adjacent to it. Controls and reagent blanks were clean. Taken with chapters 3 to 4, 3 independent systems now agree. Camera, presence in the bathroom near the fatal window, carrier road data, movement aligned to the window, and biology, Arias's DNA with Travis's blood in the corridor. That alignment limits innocent explanations without resorting to speculation. This is how a homicide crime is proven. Small facts that converge. The lab has spoken. The interview room now has to match the clock. Contact with the former partner began soon after the scene was secured and the access map was built. Early conversations were voluntary and calm. She said she was not in Mesa around the critical window and described a road trip whose broad outline was later supported by rental records and cell site movement. The immediate conflict was simple. The camera timeline placed Travis Alexander alive in his bathroom late that day. Friends expected to hear from him soon after and never did. A flat denial would only hold if the digital and biological lanes were wrong. They weren't. When detectives presented portions of the electronic evidence, the account shifted. The new version kept her in the house but introduced 2 masked intruders who, she said, attacked Travis and spared her. Investigators documented the statement without argument and compared it to what the case already held. A single, contained scene with no secondary location, a palm impression in blood on the master area wall with a mixed STR profile tying the decedent and the former partner together after injury. A .25 casing in the bathroom corridor, and a phone pattern that went dark exactly when the afternoon window closed. 2 unknown assailants leave different signatures, forced entry, extra DNA, stray shoe patterns, voices on neighbor accounts. None of that surfaced. Over time, the narrative shifted again. By the time court approached, the story became self-defense. A sudden argument, a struggle, and fragmented memory around the most violent minutes. In U.S. late cases, it's not unusual for statements to evolve as evidence becomes public. That's why investigators work on a fixed timeline first. Every version is measured against anchors that don't move. EXIF sequence, carrier logs, travel records, biological contact, and clinical findings from the medical examiner. Here, each revision solved a new problem raised by the artifacts, but created a new conflict with another lane. The denial couldn't survive the photos. The intruder tale couldn't survive the closed-world scene. The self-defense claim had to live alongside a blood-embedded palm impression in the hallway and a pattern of injuries the ME described as multiple and rapidly lethal inside a confined bathroom. Procedurally, the interviews were recorded, time-stamped, and accompanied by standard rights advisements. When a claim changed, detectives didn't argue. They documented. They marked what the speaker said about entry, the sequence in the bathroom, post-incident actions, and any mention of weapons. Each element was checked against the chain of custody for physical items and the already verified metadata. The question was never who told the best story. It was which statement could coexist with the room's physics and the hour's clock. A practical point stood out. The intruder account depended on chaos and flight, but the telephony and road miles fit an organized multi-state loop that began before the afternoon window and ended with a meeting the next day in Utah, where a witness noticed darker hair and cuts on hands. The self-defense posture depended on a momentary explosion, but the prosecutor would later argue that extra fuel capacity via borrowed gas cans and a 25 theft report filed weeks before the homicide fit a different kind of planning entirely. In interviews, those facts were parked without rhetoric. The case did not need adjectives, it needed alignment. Credibility is not about tone in the room, it's about collision with evidence that was built without the speaker's input. The last normal window was set before any interview. The bathroom photos were recovered before any narrative. The mixture on the wall was typed before any claim of memory gaps. In this homicide crime, the statements are another class of evidence, but they are tested, not trusted. Where they matched the anchors, they were retained. Where they diverged, the divergence was preserved for court. There's a human dimension to this phase. People who end up in interview rooms often feel cornered, and cornered people reach for explanations. The task is to let the science do the sorting. Respect is not incompatible with rigor. You can acknowledge stress and still refuse to move the timestamps. In towns like Mesa, where routine keeps people on time, the simplest truth often wins. The room doesn't lie, and the clock doesn't take sides. The arc out of the interview suite is straightforward. The state will argue premeditation using the corridor of movement, the biological contact after injury, and the recovered .25 casing against the pre-offense theft report. The defense will present self-defense supported by testimony about fear, memory, and dynamics in a small space. Those are proper legal positions. The next step is to test them under oath with rules of evidence and cross-examination. Nothing more, nothing less. Court replaces interview rooms, exhibits replace theories. By the time this case reached Maricopa County Superior Court in the spring following the homicide, the lanes were fixed. A single scene inside a Mesa master suite, a narrow afternoon window, and artifacts that had been built before any statement was made. The task for the jury was not to decide which story sounded better. It was to decide which account could live beside the room and the clock without contradiction. The state opened with sequence. Jurors saw the recovered photo run from the water-damaged camera, ordinary images that by EXIF time placed Travis Alexander alive in his bathroom late in the day. Chain of custody for the camera and card was formal and unbroken, sealed, right-blocked, hashed, and re-imaged by a second analyst for redundancy. Prosecutors did not claim the pictures showed violence. They claimed the pictures showed time and place. That distinction matters because it leaves no room to argue the images were theatrical. They were clocks. Next came contact. The state's criminalist walked the jury through the palm impression within blood on the master corridor wall. STR testing supported a mixture, Travis plus Jodi Arias. The testimony was purposely plain. The impression sat in blood, so the contact was post-injury. Statistics were given. Overreach was avoided. Jurors were reminded that this was not background transfer from ordinary life. It was a trace that only exists after bleeding has begun inside the confined master area. Movement followed. Call detail records and cell site usage bracketing the afternoon window showed silence where routine once lived, and reappearance along a multi-state drive consistent with the rental car's high mileage. Clerks' observations at return, missing floor mats, notes of reddish staining, were labeled as observations, not lab conclusions. The prosecution's point was simpler. You can drive long distances without leaving many receipts if you extend range, and the jury heard gas can loan testimony to support that planning inference. The state also parked a pre-offense .25 theft report in the timeline and set it next to the .25 casing recovered at scene. Without the firearm, there could be no match, and the state didn't pretend otherwise. They argued convergence, not magic. The defense theory was self-defense. Counsel described a sudden fight and memory gaps around the most violent minutes. They questioned how precisely a camera clock could anchor a timeline and pressed on the interpretation of injury sequence in the medical examiner's report. They argued that the absence of the gun left open more than one path through the facts. Experts spoke about intimate partner dynamics and fear in confined spaces. The defense asked jurors to find reasonable doubt in the gaps between artifacts rather than the artifacts themselves. Cross-examination narrowed those gaps. Prosecutors compared the self-defense claim to the earlier denials and the intruder account, then turned back to the fixed anchors. EXIF sequence inside the bathroom. Post-injury biological contact in the corridor. Cell site patterns that tracked a long loop before and after the silence, and a return to Utah the next day with a witness noting darkened hair and hand cuts. The state's closing avoided flourish. These systems don't know each other, camera, phone, lab, and they all say the same hour in the same house. The defense closed by reminding jurors that absent the gun and perfect precision on sequence, the state's picture required inferences that should not substitute for certainty in a murder crime. Deliberations ended with a single answer. The jury found first-degree murder, premeditation proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict did not claim omniscience about every minute. It accepted that the convergence of artifacts, travel behavior, and evolving statements left no reasonable alternative to intent formed before the fatal window. In communities like Mesa, trials aren't theater. They are the boundary between rumor and record. Guilt was settled in Maricopa County, first-degree murder. The penalty question went to two separate juries, both hung on death. Under Arizona law, that left the judge to decide. In April 2015, Judge Sherry Kaylin Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second outcome, no parole clock. The court did not retry the bathroom photos, the cell site and call records, the travel miles, or the post-injury mixed DNA. Those artifacts were already part of the verdict in this homicide crime. Appeals tested process, not physics. In March 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction and the sentence. The opinion acknowledged concerns about publicity and conduct, but found no basis to overturn the judgment given the evidentiary record. As of August 16, 2025, nothing has changed that posture. The conviction stands, the sentence stands, custody continues for life. This case closes where it began, at a single home in Mesa, Arizona, and it holds because independent systems agreed. A camera's timestamps, a phone's network trail, road mileage, a clinical autopsy, and a palm impression set within blood. None of those systems knows the others. Together they fix time, place, and contact. The human lesson is narrow and useful. In intimate spaces, documentation protects the truth when memory cannot. Pay attention to boundaries, to patterns, and to early signs of volatility. Intervention is always easier than reconstruction. As your guide through this case, I saw how routine can hide risk. Boundaries matter. When control, stalking, or sudden secrecy appear, speak up early. Tell a friend. Seek help. Document. In our communities, accountability isn't vengeance. It's how we protect the living and honor the dead. What part of this timeline struck you most? Where are you watching from? If the video helped or missed the mark, tell me why. If this story reached you, drop your city in the comments and please subscribe to the channel for more careful, fact-driven, true crime reporting.